Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Andrea Zagaria. He's a PhD student at the University of Trento in Italy. And today we're focusing mostly, but not only, on one of his papers, is Evolutionary Psychology, a Scientific Revolution, a bibliometric response to BUS 2020. So basically, we're going to discuss whether evolutionary psychology is actually a scientific revolution, and also talk about some other sub branches in psychology and how they relate to one another. So, Andrea, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
For me too. Thank you for having invited me here.
Sure. So before we get into evolutionary psychology specifically, I would like to ask you about one of the papers where you analyze trends and the prominence of four major schools of thought in scientific psychology, which you call or you identify as neuroscience, cognitivism, behaviorism, and psychoanalysis, and also their intersections. And you cover the period from 1979 to 2020. So could you tell us about that study? How did you approach it? I mean, what sort of methodology you used, and also the results you got there?
Yeah. So we were interested in tracking the major subdisciplines in psychology from a bibliometric point of view. And there were some important papers on this regard published, especially in the 90s. The first paper, if I remember correctly, is by Freeman. The leading author is Freeman, and is published is 1993 or something like it. And because there was a debate in that years, speaking about a cognitive revolution, so there were some cognitivist scientists claiming that the cognitivism was a paradigm in a Kuhnian sense, and maybe we can talk about that later. But a paradigm is a set of ontological and methodological assumption of a science, which for some time, usually a long time, provides all the scientists in that area with the means and the kind of questions they have to answer to. Okay,
right.
So of course, as always it happens in psychology, people from the cognitivism were saying, "Oh, we are the most important guys in the field, and the cognitivism is the long-awaited paradigm in psychology." And so some scholars were interested in trying to answer quantitatively that question, because of course, if you go to answer a certain scholar about their preferred theory, they are going to tell that theory is the most important one, the most beautiful one. And so they did this very simple study, which is different from ours, but they tried to track the trends during time. And what they found is that cognitivism was rising, but that the prevalence of cognitivism in scientific psychology wasn't that high to give it the status of a paradigm. And so after that seminal study, there was a special issue in the American Psychology. So it was kind of, I think it's a quite cited study. And there was some debate about it. And then they did other studies in the years later, like refining the methodology. But the last study to date was published in 2007 by Spare. And the last years were untouched. And one thing the scholars after Freeman did was to add neuroscience into the equation. So they tried to investigate also neuroscience. But there were some technicalities and some methodological problems. And so we tried to reapproach the issue more than 10 years later, the last study published, and to do a more fine-grained methodology. And what we did is that we expanded the set of keywords in order to operationalize each of one of these subdisciplines. And we use a sort of protocol to do that. So we first identified a seed term, and then we identified that potential of associated terms with that seed terms for each school of thought. And we ran an analysis on PsycInfo, which is the official database of the APA, the American Psychological Association, to detect which ones of these indicators were in terms of frequency mostly associated with the seed terms. For instance, you have, the C term for neuroscience was near, okay, with a wildcard. And then we associate a list of descriptors, and we at the end we got the 10 indicator which were more appropriate to investigate neuroscience. That were, I'm just listing a few: near, of course, then brain, nerve, and the wildcard. The wildcard is an asterisk, and it helps you retrieving all the words that end with different letters, but that are associated with the same root. For instance, when you have near asterisk, you can find neuroscience, neural, and blah 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 blah. And so we found for each one of these school of thought a set of indicators, and we inputted them in specific field codes, that is, specific parts of the document, in order for the analysis to be easily replicable in the future. So we investigated, for instance, the title, the abstract, the keywords of the paper, and the APA keywords, who are different from the keywords selected by the authors, and the medical subject headings, which are the keywords, the official keywords by PubMed. And what we found, and now we get to the most interesting part, is that neuroscience, at least from the 1979 to 2020, which was the period we investigated because of one indicator of the influence of the journal was available only for that kind of period. In that period, so from the 80s to nowadays, the most important paradigm, the most important subdiscipline in psychology is by far neuroscience, by far. Okay. And that was kind of underestimated by previous studies. And the second one is cognitivism, of course, and we see that psychoanalysis and behaviorism are in decline, especially psychoanalysis, but also behaviorism. Mm-hmm. And that is speaking of mainstream psychology. That is all, peer-reviewed journal indexed in PsycInfo. Things get a little bit different when you focus just on highly influential journals. That is, thanks to the social science journal citation reports, which is, the official indexes of the impact factor on the journal. We were able to detect for each one of your investigated the most influential journals in psychology, and we selected the first 4 of them. And we investigated the papers only in that kind of journal, so representing, very influential papers, which are different from the mainstream. And there we found a similar but kind of slightly different scenario, so in which cognitivism is higher than neuroscience. And then we have behaviorism and psychoanalysis. And then lastly, but not less importantly, we investigated non-English papers. Okay. That is, all papers which are published in non-English language. But of course, in order to have them indexed in PsycInfo, you have to have your original paper in your language, non-English language, but also the title and the abstract and the keywords in English. So you can investigate it through English keywords, even though the paper is not in English. And what we found in that specific source is that that psychoanalysis is still on one of the most important school of thought. And that is very, very interesting, because it is like a very different scenario from the scientific or mainstream psychology. And some scientometric studies quite robustly associate publishing in your own language rather than English, if you're not an English speaker, from the necessity to communicate with your local community and to have an impact on your local community, instead of, having your career advanced if you want to publish on super influential journals. And so what we think is that psychoanalysis is still very prevalent in clinical practice, when, clinicians want to communicate their results to their niche, their social niche. And but it is not important in terms of purely scientific endeavors. So it is still a common practice to help people in their everyday lives, but it is not successful research program in the scientific landscape. And lastly, I want to notice that even though I'm talking about percentage because of course we computed relative frequencies, what we found is that the majority of papers indexed in PsycInfo are not tied to none of these theories.
Okay.
Yeah, and that is very interesting because it means maybe that large part of psychology is not tied to any specific grand theory about the mind, but is more like applied. And that
Applied
is,
psychology.
yeah, and that points back to the non-paradigmatic issue, but maybe we have time to discuss about it later. Yes.
Yeah, sure, sure. No, there are lots of interesting things that you mentioned there. I mean, one of them is I'm very curious about it because, of course, I don't know to what extent you could give us more information about that. But when you mentioned that, for example, when you included papers that were written in non-English languages, I mean, in other languages, that psychoanalysis was more prevalent, at least when it comes to to its clinical applications. It's very interesting because I always had this idea that outside of the English speaking world, like the US, Canada, United Kingdom, in continental Europe, let's say, even today, psychoanalysis would have a very big presence.
Yeah, definitely yes. Definitely yes. Especially if you, I mean, because that's a different aim, you know. In of course, so I'm not a psychoanalyst, so I do respect psychoanalysis from a historical point of view, and I do think there are some interesting things still nowadays. If you think about intersubjective psychoanalysis, if you think about scholars such as Fonagy in the UK and blah blah blah. But even though I respect some part of it, I don't share at all, you know, the theoretical assumptions about the mind from the psychoanalytic point of view, because I don't think they're scientific. And so you clearly see that at least, I don't know if you're familiar with Lakatos and his theory of scientific progress, but he would have said that psychoanalysis is no longer a generative, progressive research program. So it doesn't have anymore some predictions, some new prediction to be tested, and that leads, you know, is programmed to advance and to be more competitive than other research programs. Because if you think, I don't know, if you have some insights about human behavior and you can test them experimentally, I think that other subdisciplines would you know, outperform psychoanalysis for sure. But still, in the clinical practice, and as you mentioned, in the continental Europe, also academic clinical psychology scenario, also here in Italy, psychoanalysis is still a big thing. When you go to the university, a lot of psychoanalysis there, and you are trained, you know, many friends of mine still did a classical psychoanalytic training, which is kind of problematic in my opinion, but still it is something that is there and is real and alive. So we have to acknowledge it. Yeah.
No, even here in Portugal, for example, I'm not sure if they still do that, but at least up till 9, 8 years ago, they were still teaching Freudian theory, even in anthropology courses. So
yeah, and especially people from the humanities. And I think there is the same study by Robin or Freeman, also in the 90s, demonstrated that psychoanalysis is still super popular among the humanists, you know. So people from the, and also in my personal life, when you talk with psychology with someone who is coming from the humanities, such as philosophy, architecture, or even economics, but especially, you know, that kind of you know, letters, that kind of studies, and they are all fascinated with psychoanalysis. And that's kind of, you know, annoying for me that do you know Freud, do you know Jung, especially Lacan? They love Lacan. I hate Lacan, you know. I don't have anything personally with any Lacanian, but I really can't stand Lacan as a theorist. And so yeah, but it's still very 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 popular, and very, because that is very catchy, you know, because I think that Freud did a wonderful job in selling his ideas out, his ideas to the public, because, you know, many ideas. I did a wonderful history of psychology course when I was undergraduate, and my professor was kind of critic towards psychoanalysis, and he showed us how Freud took many ideas from the mainstream of the clinical psychology of the 19th century and made them very palatable to the public. But, you know, everyone already knew what the unconscious was, everyone already knew the importance of sexuality. Everyone already knew the importance of being in a kind of altered state of consciousness during psychotherapy, that is hypnosis, to get your problems solved. And everyone knew, especially, for example, Pierre Janet, which is more on trend today, already knew the power of distressing events, that is traumatic events, in determining your later adult life. So Freud did something. Of course, he was a genius, of course, but he was especially capable in selling his ideas, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what it is specifically about psychoanalysis, but apparently it provides people with very compelling psychological narratives. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you even see it in Hitchcock movies. So,
Yeah.
and the narratives are actually very compelling, at least in the movies. So, when it comes to psychoanalysis more directly, I'm not so sure. But anyway, apparently people love it. So.
Yeah, because they're very romantic, and so he was very intelligent, adopting these Greek names. So your Oedipus complex, your Electra complex, and you have these very catchy things. You feel like you're like almost a romantic hero, in discovering your drives. And so it was, of course, I think that psychotherapy has to be somehow romantic, but not necessarily to that level. Yes.
Yeah. So another thing, just before we get into the paradigmatic bit, one comment that I was going to make is that it's interesting how sometimes we carve up the different disciplines and how we create different branches, because I would imagine that many people who identify as neuroscientists wouldn't identify themselves as psychologists or of being part of a branch of psychology. I mean, many times we look at neuroscience as something separate from psychology, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it depends on your assumptions about the nature of the mind. I'm very passionate about the philosophy of mind, generally speaking, and I am a materialist, so I don't think we have, I also think we have a spirit, but I'm a sort of panpsychist, but still, I do spend some time in thinking about the very nature of the mind. And as you mentioned, many neuroscience don't identify themselves as a psychologist because they are kind of skeptical about psychology, and they want to do hard science. We are doing the real stuff here, guys. No, so, and they don't want to be merged with someone that they see as something less scientific or like softer. Problem is that yes, I think that some neuroscientists do not identify themselves as psychologists, even though the majority of them don't never spend properly their time in answering, at least to themselves privately, the question of what mind is. Because if you try to answer that question, it's a very difficult question, but it's very difficult that you see the brain as something completely detached from our mental life. So you are a psychologist in a sense. But I would also say this to be noted, that I have a conversation with André Bitterman, who is a brilliant scholar in meta science, so science about science, so this kind of study. And he said to me that PsycInfo has, in the last years, it has incorporated more and more journals, purely neuroscientific journals. And so maybe our results are slightly biased in a overestimation of neuroscience. But still, I would say that it is undoubtedly the most prominent approach in psychology as for now. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a comment. It was just that I think that many neuroscientists out there would position themselves closer to something like biology than psychology, I guess.
Definitely, yes. Yeah.
So, and at a certain point in the same, I think it's in the same study, you say that the study supports the inference that scientific psychology is a non-paradigmatic or pre-paradigmatic discipline. So could you explain that, and also what a paradigm is exactly?
Yeah, definitely. So I would explain it through an example. So if you go to a physicist, even an undergraduate in physics, and ask them, well, what is force or what is energy? It is very likely they will all answer the same. So I have the definition here. So a force is an influence that can cause an object to change its velocity unless counterbalanced by other forces. And there is a specific measure, to measure the force, which is the Newton, and no one is going to debate about it. And the Newton has a specific formula, which is kilogram times meter per squared second, and no one is going to discuss about it. And if you ask them what is an energy, they will likely answer energy is the capacity to do work, and it has a specific formula, and no one is going to debate about it. And if you go to a biologist and you ask them what is a gene, no one is going, like very, very few people, maybe less than 1%, will be doubtful about a gene is. So a gene is a sequence of nucleotide bases, which are blah, 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 blah. And if you ask them what an inflammation is, everyone is going to agree. Well, if you go to a psychologist and ask them what emotion is or intelligence is, and not to speak about the basic term of cognition, for instance, or mind or consciousness. And if you go, for instance, I have a background in clinical psychology and I studied clinical psychology. So if you go and ask what is attachment, if you go to the developmental psychologist and ask what is attachment, they will answer one thing. If you go to a personality psychology and you ask them what is attachment, they will answer another thing. Similar but different. And you ask, clinical psychology, what is trauma? Even in the most recent APA handbook of trauma, there is no universal definition of trauma. There is no events in the world which is traumatic by definition. It's not speaking of mental disorder, depression, and whatever. And so this is very interesting because like trying to also addressing your question about the nature of the paradigm and the Thomas Kuhn, because the philosophy of science which is tied to the concept of paradigm was developed by Thomas Kuhn in the 60s. And what struck me when I read again the structure of the scientific revolutions, which is the book that he published in 1962 about this kind of theory, he stated, like I'm citing him literally, because in the preface of the book, he said at page 9 and 10, so he was invited. So this is the thing to know before hearing to this the quote. He was invited at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Science at Stanford University. So he spent some time there as a visiting scholar. And he said when he was there for a period, then he said, somehow the practice of astronomy, physics, chemistry, or biology normally fails to evoke the controversies over fundamentals that today seem endemic among, say, psychologists or sociologists. Okay? Yep. Attempting to discover the source of that difference, that is very important, led me to recognize the role in scientific research of what I since called paradigm. And so this is mind-blowing, because Thomas Kuhn was prompt to create his super influential theory when he discovered, like, personally, the chaos you have as a training psychologist, or even as a licensed psychology or a scholar in psychology, which is chaos, pure chaos. And I also published a paper about it. We compared in 12 introductory books to psychology and the APA Dictionary of Psychology, some definition of core constructs of psychology, like mind, consciousness, intelligence, and all the definitions differ for the major part. And so there is a paradigm. A paradigm is there is also a quote by Kuhn on this regard, but I would say that I would define it as a hardcore set of methodological and ontological assumptions about the subject of studies. And that is, we know we have to study this thing, and we know how to study this thing. And no one is going to debate over how to study it, on what to study. And Kuhn called it the puzzle solving activity. That is, we know how to do that, and then we have different puzzles to solve, but we know how to solve it.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that the pre-paradigmatic status of psychology has always been acknowledged by leading scholars in the field. So if you go to James, back in the William James at the end of the 20th century,
The 19th century, I think.
yeah. At the end of the 19th century, at the end of his book, The Psychology Briefer Course, he said that psychology, it at the stage of physics before Newton or chemistry before Lavoisier. Okay, but this kind of quote was, this kind of claim was endorsed repeatedly over the course of scientific psychology by very diverse scholars, and they're very famous, such as Vygotsky. I don't know if you know him, but very influential developmental psychologist. He spoke about the crisis of psychology in the 20s, and then Heidelberg in the 30s, and then Cronbach himself in the 50s. He compared the scientific psychology to a circus. It did it, like, literally. And then Kuhn, as I said before, then Sigmund Koch, which was a very important scholar in the 80s. And then we have less known psychologists who, nevertheless, they dedicated all their lives in studying this thing, which was called by Sigmund Koch and then later by Gregor Rix as the problem of psychology. So we don't have a shared theory, and we are certainly at another stage of scientific development in respect to chemistry or physics or biology.
And so this is still true in 2024, right?
I would say undoubtedly yes. Undoubtedly yes. Yeah.
So let me ask you. I don't know if you can answer this question exactly, but I mean, what would you say are perhaps some of the reasons why, over the course of more than 100 years, apparently the same problem is still here in psychology?
It's a big question. I think this is that question, $1 billion question. I think there are two different main reasons. The first one is the hardest one, and I don't know if we will ever able to solve it. There is, I would say, three reasons. Like the first one is the very famous hard problem of consciousness. That is very difficult to integrate what we are from the objective point of view and from the subjective point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second one is the complexity of the human mind and behavior. We are inherently complex, and it is inherently difficult to maybe we will able better to. I think that we have a wonderful promising line of research, speaking of behavioral genetics, in the years to come. But still, I don't know if we will have a major shared theory. And the third problem, which is also linked to the fact that evolutionary psychology could be more prominent in the evolution in the broader scenario of psychology, but it is not, is that, and you interviewed Dan Sperber, so you know it very well, that we as human, one compelling evolutionary theory is that our reason, our capacity to reason, is not driven by the necessity to seek an objective truth, but rather to persuade the other humans socially. And so we seem to be hardwired from the biological point of view to conflate the descriptive is. So this is a mechanism, and this is the way it works, with the rather morally ought. So this should be how things should be. And so this is very problematic, for instance, for evolutionary psychology, when they talk about gender difference or violence or homicide or I don't know, stereotypes. And the problem, the main problem, which I see in many scientists as well, which should be at least less biased in this regard, is that you can't conflate the descriptive is with the moral ought. They are completely different level. If I say this is how the mind, this is how the mind of a rapist works, and I'm trying to understand the rapists, I'm not trying to justify his behaviors or his or her behaviors, because that would be nonsense. And so I think that it is very difficult to have an objective psychology, because there is this problem that you are studying someone or something who has the consciousness of understanding the theory you are proposing and use them as they wish to justify themselves. And so this is problematic. And so this is very problematic. I mean, if we study the birds and their social behaviors, no birds is going to see, you told me in a paper that I'm more prone naturally to rape the other birds, female birds, so I can do that. But if you speak about humans, that is difficult. So it is a major obstacle, I think.
Yeah. And do you think that perhaps another problem here, and this is something you also mentioned in your paper, but I'm not sure if you would call it a problem, has to do with the insularity of the different subdisciplines in psychology?
Yes, definitely. Because I don't know if as an academic, I spent a lot of time, and I'm still understanding if I want to be an academic for all my life. But I spent a lot of my time, reading the description of the journals when you want to submit a paper, and all of them, they claim to be interdisciplinary. It is very cool to claim I am interdisciplinary. Oh, this is an interdisciplinary journal, and actually, when you go to the evidence, it is very. For instance, there is a study published in the 2014 by Kiselica, I think, and Kiselica and Ruscio, and they show that in clinical psychology they investigated humanistic school of thought, psychoanalysis, and I think cognitivism, and a cognitive behavioral approach, and they found that each one of school of thought is likely to mention only the papers to each one school of thought. So there is this very, compartmentalization. And also in our study, we, the large majority of intersections between these four schools of thought, with the exception of cognitivism and neuroscience, which are largely contaminated, and to a lesser extent between behaviorism and neuroscience, which there is also a contamination there, are kind of negligible, at least if compared to the broader scenario of the prominence to the other theories. And of course, it is just a thought. We have to ponder more about it and do other studies. But this easily matches also my personal experience as an academic. And this is linked to a broader problem of the current academic landscape. So people are interested in publishing, and they have very few time to read properly, to read not only in their field of research, but generally speaking. And I have personally met some people who were very recognized in that specific field, and they didn't know anything, not on psychology broadly speaking, but in the super closer field of research, because they didn't care, did not have the time, and blah blah blah. And so I do think there is a major problem. We don't have the Renaissance model of intellectual who spent a larger time trying to be interdisciplinary. Of course, it is impossible nowadays to be like purely interdisciplinary, because the amount of knowledge is unmanageable.
It's not feasible.
It's not feasible, but not that hyper specialization would be beneficial. And so yes, so I think that the lack of cross fertilization is indeed the problem nowadays. Yes.
Okay, so let's now talk about the work you've done on evolutionary psychology specifically, because David Buss a few years ago, I think in 2020 or something like that, called it a scientific revolution. So we've already talked about paradigms here. So first of all, what is a scientific revolution? And then we can talk about his claim specifically.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that the best thing to understand what a scientific revolution is to briefly understand how the progress of science occurs according to Kuhn. And the first stage is the pre-paradigmatic stage, and we have talked about it. So we have plenty of schools who disagree over fundamentals. For instance, Kuhn made the example of optics before the book Optics by Newton. And he said that there were different ontologies and methodologies. There was the Aristotelian school of thought, the Epicurean school of thought, the Platonic school of thought, and they had different ontologies and methodologies. But then, and this is the pre-paradigmatic stage. But then the book by Newton came out, and it was a watershed. And slowly, people in optics began to understand that the best way of explaining things was not Aristotelian, Epicurean, and Platonic, but was the new research program initiated by Newton, and this gradually took over the other school of thought. Yeah. And so when a school, a rising school of thought, after years and after of course it is not that linear, but after going against different kind of scientific, sociological, or psychological oppositions, becomes the norm. And you have 3 indexes in order to understand that a school of thought has become a paradigm. So you have first stage, pre-paradigmatic; second stage, scientific revolution. And when you attain the third stage, which is called the stage of normal science, you can understand that now we are in a normal science period by 3 indexes, according to Kuhn. First, what you have in the theory is the customary practice a newborn in the that discipline is exposed to. And you can look at it easily in introductory books given to undergraduate. So imagine physics. If we go to different physics university and you consult different introductory books, they will say almost the same, maybe with slight difference. But no one is going to disagree over Newton, over the Newton, the measure unit, or on Joule or anything. And if you go to biology department, each one of these introductory books will talk about Darwin and Mendel and Fischer and the modern synthesis. Again, if you go to psychology, that is kind of different. But you have this kind of first index. Then secondly, the scholar in that discipline do not have to justify themselves when they explain their theory. So I take for granted that everyone agrees about what a gene is, or what a Newton is. And then the third index is the progressive marginalization of other scholars. For instance, I don't think that there is no one in physics nowadays that is called themselves Aristotelic or Platonic or Epicurean, like very few people in biology call them creationists. I think almost no one after Darwin. And so this is the kind of normal science. But then, and so the paradigm, because the paradigm is occurring in that stage. So the scientific revolution is the second stage. And then what may happen is that the scientific endeavors might be facing some anomalies, so some things that you cannot explain thanks to your usual normal science perspective. And then you encounter a phase of crisis, which is the fourth stage. And then maybe another theory similar to the optics takes over because it is better than the other ones, and you have a scientific revolution again, and then normal science again, and then this kind of endless cycle. But of course, this kind of watershed event occurs in a relatively long period of time. You don't have a paradigm shift every 10 years, but we are speaking about centuries, or we are speaking about long times nevertheless. So a scientific revolution, according to Kuhn, and that is why I took the instance by David Bayes critically, is that something that you can easily understand. If a scientific revolution has occurred, or even if it is happening as we speak, you can see it in different indexes. But the one I chose to investigate was the prominence, because as I said before, one index of the scientific revolution is that you are gradually taking over the other competitors. And so that is why I decided what to do to investigate from the bibliometric point of view the evolutionary psychology research program against its main competitor, which is the standard social science model.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the results you got there. But just before that, just to be clear, in his 2020 paper, does David Buss use the term scientific revolution in a Kuhnian way as well?
Yes. So he never cited the structure of scientific revolution, but it was very closely to do that, because he used a Kuhnian lexicon. So speaking of scientific revolution, paradigm shift, and he did some quite Kuhnian examples, such as he said that evolutionary psychology was the same as Copernicus' heliocentric theory, which was actually a paradigm shift in a Kuhnian sense, because no one today, unless some very crazy people, believes that the Earth is at the center of the universe. So and also it analyzed the history of psychology applying this Kuhnian perspective. We say, we had back in the days we had the structuralism, and then behaviorism takes over, and then cognitivism, and then now we have evolutionary psychology. Yeah.
Right. So tell us then about the bibliometric analysis you did there when it comes to the prevalence of evolutionary psychology within psychology more broadly. And also you compared it, I think, to what Lida Cosmides and John Tooby in the early 90s called the standard social model approach in psychology, which is sort of the more sociocultural approach, the more environmentalist approach. So how do you do that, and what results did you get there?
Okay, so basically the methodology was kind of similar to the one I described before. So first of all, we investigated the APA thesaurus, which is the official controlled vocabulary of the APA, and basically it is a controlled vocabulary because it controls for redundancy. For instance, the word work-related injuries is used to design work-related injuries, workplace injuries, occupational injuries, and occupational-related injuries. So when you type in PsycInfo for occupational-related injuries, the official name it is associated with is work-related injuries. So in order to use some keywords, we started looking at the APA thesaurus. And then we chose, as we did in the other study, some seed terms, that is evolutionary psychology and sociocultural factors, respectively for the evolutionary psychology and standard social science model, henceforth EP and SSM to be faster. And then we investigated, because the APA thesaurus is a hierarchical structure, so it has like more important names, and then it has narrower terms and related terms who are on the same level. And we investigated, qualitatively, I think 60 or 70 names, and then we decided qualitatively what to use for our with I was alone in this paper. I decided what to do which specific descriptor to use. You could also use a quantitative way of deciding what indicators to use, but it wasn't preferable in this study. And for instance, for EP, we have animal behavior, animal cognition, animal communication, behavioral genetics, and blah, blah, blah.
So you would classify behavioral genetics as being part of EP in this case?
Yeah, definitely yes, because this is a beautiful question, because I decided to investigate EP broadly speaking. So not the Santa Barbara EP, so, with the massive modularity and the EEA assumption and all that kind of stuff, but more broadly, because you have the standard social science model, which is a heuristics used by Tooby and Cosmides. There is no department in somewhere in the world called the SSM, and there is no one who called themselves SSM because it's kind of derogatory. And so I would identify quite broadly the SSM, and so I wanted to assure EP to be as broad as the SSM. And so what I try to do is not to compare the Santa Barbara EP against the SSM, but broadly all approaches, all papers actually, who mentioned evolutionary laden concept and standard culturalist concept to operationalize the vision that nature is important or culture is important, right? And which is kind of dichotomic, but we will see not that much. And so yeah, I do think that behavioral genetics is somehow evolutionary laden, because the basic assumption of behavioral genetics is that genes are very important in determining your behavior. And unless you think that genes are untied to the evolutionary process, which is impossible, still you are somehow tied to evolution.
But it's very important that you mentioned that, and I asked you more about that because many people would probably not classify behavior genetics under evolutionary psychology. They would think about them as two different disciplines. And also, I mean, there are people who are trying theoretically to integrate evolutionary psychology with behavior genetics, but actually, if you talk with a behavior geneticist and an evolutionary psychologist, their methodologies and what they're trying to study many times are very different things.
Definitely yes. So yeah, I made that very clear in the paper that I was investigating a broad sense evolutionary psychology and not the famous one by the Santa Barbara one. And so, for instance, I also included human behavioral ecology, which is
that's interesting, because many people would say that is part of anthropology.
Yeah, right? But still they are studying human behavior with evolutionary assumptions, even though they are kind of different from the ones from the EP. But still, there is this underlying assumption, which is evolution is important in order to understand human behavior. And we can debate over the methodology or whatever, but there is a very huge assumption. And I still don't think how scientists could ignore evolution, because of course no one in the SSM program would deny that we are product of evolution, but somehow I don't know how they say that it's not that important. It is almost negligible. And so so this is the fight in between the and if you think about it, is a long-standing fight in between. In philosophy was the fight between innatists and empiricists. So
I asked you about also human behavioral ecology because I know that there are many human behavioral ecologists that are not very fond of the evolutionary psychologists, and they present themselves as studying ecology, and ecological factors tend to be environmental factors and not really.
Definitely yes. Yeah, I would say the Santa Barbara IP is somehow, a lot of people are dissatisfied with it, and I think there are some reasons for that. But yes, I want to this is very important. I didn't want to compare Santa Barbara IP, but the broader assumption of evolution as something important and not negligible. So this is the main thing. Still, as we will see, the results are rather they speak from themselves. And then on the other end, the list comprehending many indicators for the SSM comprehended terms like acculturation, sexism, patriarchy, microaggression, minority group, racism, gender identity, feminism, and blah blah blah. So this kind of we are all if you open a tweet in the last 10 years, you are encountering for sure this kind of words. So if you are a little bit into the debate, especially in the US, these kind are very trendy nowadays.
But let me just ask you, since it included terms like feminism, would it also include studies from the humanities, like, for example, women's studies, gender studies, and stuff like that? Or
I'm including everything is indexed in PsycInfo, so everything is believed by the official team of PsycInfo as being it has to be included in the PsycInfo database. And actually, this is one of So because my paper was commented somehow critically by William Costello and Douglas. William Costello is a PhD student of David
Yeah,
Buss.
I interviewed him on the show. So
Really?
back
Okay.
in 2022. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. And they redid an analysis, and they had this this kind of one of their criticism toward my paper was that PsycInfo included not scientific journals.
Mhm.
And they said, because Annals of Dyslexia is not a scientific journal. And I said that I answered them like privately. I also want to publish another paper regarding this, but I said that well, it's very different. It's very difficult to draw a line specifically where science begins and where science ends. And so it is very, even though you were right, I would not know how to operationalize that kind of instance in a bibliometric study. First thing. Second thing, it is very difficult to discard a journal as a non-scientific in an ipse dixit fashion. So I can say it is not scientific, but I have to demonstrate it, because otherwise my own behavior is very non-scientific. And so I would say that, of course, my research has some limitations, and of course, what I can do in the future to make it more robust is, for instance, to investigate only the highly influential journals, as I said before. So if I tie my research to largely unknowledged, important and influential journals in psychology, that would be kind of, another step in that direction. Even though personally, I don't think is that the results would change much, because looking at flagship journals of such as the American Psychologists and the kind of papers they publish nowadays, they are very toward the SSM scenario, because there was this very influence of the SSM in the academic US landscape. But we can do that, of course. We can see if that change. But what I obtained, and to a lesser extent, what Costello and Douglas obtained, even though somehow differently, and I do think there are some serious problems with their methodology, but we can talk about that later, is that, well, in mainstream psychology, that is in the all peer-reviewed journals indexed in PsycInfo, by official team, by the APA, the evolutionary psychology, broadly speaking, starts in the 1950, because this search was covering a broader time span than the other one. So I investigated from the 1950 to 2022 actually. We see it like starting at about 3% of the overall publications, and then we gradually reach 4% in the last years. On the other end, we see that the SSM start at about 5% in the 50s, and we reach actually 10%, 11% in the last years. And we say that the gap is, the growth of the SSM is particularly evident from the end of the 80s on. So from the 90s.
Oh, that's interesting. So that ends up coinciding also with the advent of what we call evolutionary psychology in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's kind of paradoxical, but yes. And so we can say that on average, the SSM laden contributions are twice actually 2.20 times the evolutionary psychology contributions. And in the last years, that is 2020, 2022, this ratio is even larger, is about 2.5.
Okay.
And even in the William Costello and Douglas reanalysis, which has some problem because they added 2 words to the EP keywords, set of keywords, so it was unbalanced. So EP had more keywords than SSM.
And what were those 2 keywords, by the way?
The 2 keywords were inclusive fitness, and the other one, I think, parental investment and psychological adaptation, and they removed animal cognition. So they removed animal cognition and they added inclusive fitness, parent investment, and psychological adaptation. But they did not, and they also restricted the term culture in the SSM keywords in order to avoid the term culture as used in a biology paper, that is the soil full of microorganisms. And so of course they restricted the SSM and they expanded the EP. So of course the ratio was different, but it was like a kind of a methodological concern I already expressed to them privately. And
by the way, but even with their approach, what results did they get?
Even though even with this approach, which of course will favor EP laden contributions by definition, the average ratio is 1.78, so closer to 2. In the last years, it's almost equal to mine, so 2.5. So last year's 2.5. So it is quite a big hiatus. And of course, what is the take-home message from these studies? Even though you think that their study can say something valuable, I don't think so. But even though we take this for granted, still we can't call scientific EP, evolutionary psychology, as a scientific revolution. We can't, because it's clearly outperformed by the SSM. Clearly, no one can deny that. So we have two options, or we can say I wasn't referring to scientific revolution in a Kuhnian sense, but that is kind of difficult because the terms were kind of Kuhnian laden. Or we can say, well, this is the status of affairs, and we have to do something about it. Because I also had some discussions with some evolutionary scholars, and I tried to publish this. I had some problems in publishing these papers, this paper, and I had private back channel with I would say an important evolutionary scholar who was, I would say, ideologically annoyed by my results. And I was kind of sad of that, because I was, why? You should be the hard-nosed scientist that want to debunk the ideologically laden SSM people, but you are still ideologically laden. And also, the paper by Costello and his collaborator, I see it something ideologically laden. Because I do think that, of course, if you add two words, the results will be unbalanced. But the problem is that I do share, and maybe we can get to that later. I do have sympathy for the evolutionary psychology, and also for the EP Santa Barbara EP program. I don't have anything against it. I don't share many of the criticisms they had toward the Santa Barbara EP. For instance, I had a conversation with a big person in cultural evolution, like a huge one, like one of the leading scholars in the world on this regard. And he was very aggressive towards Santa Barbara EP. And I don't understand that. I have my ideas, but of course we can't call it, even broadly speaking, as a scientific revolution.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not that surprised. I would probably be a little bit more surprised like 5 or 6 years ago, because I was very much into evolutionary psychology, and I thought that perhaps it would hold. I mean, it would be more prominent within psychology, and even more so nowadays. But as I talked with people that would fall under neuroscience, and of course I don't talk much with psychoanalysts nor behaviorists, but I know that they are not fond of evolutionary psychology. But even people from other I'm not sure if we should call them subdisciplines, but sub areas in psychology, like, for example, the social psychologists, the cultural psychologists, and even many cognitive psychologists. There are many people out there that are not fond of evolutionary psychology at all. And even the other approaches that we mentioned, behavior genetics, human behavioral ecology, many people there also do not like the evolutionary psychologists. So.
Not at all. I don't know why. I have my theory about that, but of course I don't know why. I think that one major impediment here is, as I said before, this is versus out problem. You know, the problem that you somehow, because I think that all they get very mad when evolutionary psychology, for instance, let's talk about attachment. No one is
Okay.
discussing attachment. Why? Because it's standard, because we have little kids crying for their mom, and this is, so, heart moving. But attachment is one evolutionary psychobiological motivation per definition, and no one ever discussed it. No one ever discussed Bowlby remarks about the EEA. Actually, Bowlby was the inventor of the fucking word. So it is kind of, problematic that attachment, of course there are some critics, of course there are some critics of attachment, especially during, they see attachment as something deterministic and by reductionistic, but still you don't see anyone, especially in clinics or in my own niche, that is against the concept of attachment as a evolutionary laden motivation. When you talk about mating and the gender differences in mating, which are, robustly documented by the EP, in my opinion, robustly, things start to change because people get defensive and get also, world leading scholar. For instance, I think that we could lead back this controversy to two very important people in the field in the 70s, who were, on one hand, Edward Osborne Wilson, so the author of sociobiology, on the other hand, Stephen Jay Gould. And these two people, and Gould was a very important, super important. Why I think the most cited paleontologist so far is he is super important. He also elaborated this evolutionary theory of punctuated equilibrium. So he was a leading expert in evolution. He wrote, his magnus opus about evolution. Still, when it comes to evolutionary psychology, mating or gender differences or some difference in intelligence. He wrote a lot about difference in intelligence. Good, and it was, I think, somehow ideological still, and that is a pity because he was a great scientist, And I really don't know why there is so much hate toward Santa Barbara IP. Even though I don't share some of their works, but still, I don't know. You have an opinion about that?
I'm not completely sure, but at least something that I've noticed, even when it comes to myself, when over the years I talked with, for example, anthropologists and cultural evolutionists, is that if you look across cultures, if you look at ethnographies, for example, if you do ethnographic work across different kinds of cultures, and if you're working with a more culturally oriented approach, let's say, I think it's very hard for people like that to accept the idea that most of what happens within us psychologically is innate,
Is so, what?
Innate.
Yeah.
Because I mean, actually, that's probably one of the criticisms that I would have nowadays when it comes to evolutionary psychology. First of all, many evolutionary psychologists are not aware of, they are not familiar with anthropology or anthropological literature. And so, I mean, if you ask them about something related to anthropology, many of them don't know much, to be honest. And I mean, and the other thing is that I think that perhaps some people, not all, because it depends. There are also a few evolutionary psychologists who had training in anthropology, and so those approach things a little bit differently. But some of them at least have come to the table, or when they look at things, at any kind of psychological phenomenon, they assume, or they start from a standpoint where they assume that whatever kind of psychological phenomenon they are analyzing, that that it should be in some way innate or the result of natural sexual selection or something like that?
I think this is a major problem with the Santa Barbara EP. I do think that there's I don't know how to define it, but they are very keen on the idea of being tied to real science, real biology, real things, and they're not willing, at least to my experience. Many of them are not willing to collaborate. For instance, I think that a major breakthrough for evolutionary psychology would be, more collaborative attitude toward clinical psychology.
Yeah.
Because I do think that being a clinical psychologist myself, I do think that when you have in therapy someone and you help someone, a lot of evolutionary insights are super helpful for you. Super helpful when you think about sexuality, mating, attachment, status. You see, young males depressed in their 30s because they are not attained in the status they wanted to attain, and there is a major difference, for instance, in gender difference, because as David Gary, who you interviewed, knows very well, there is, males are more prone to experience depression if status deprived than females. And that is that would be super useful for the clinician, other than stupid narrative of, oh, let's go and talk about your parents, which is useful many of the times, because I studied a lot attachment, so attachment is super important in determining your own health, mental health. But still, if you are depressed because you don't have your place in society, we don't have to talk about your parents. There is no need to do that. and so I think I don't know that there's Gilbert, for instance, the scholar Gilbert, the Australian guy, or at least he works in Australia, and he wrote something about motivations from an evolutionary perspective. Is closer to the clinical scenario, but still, if we talk about hardcore evolutionary Santa Barbara EP scientists, which is a small but very living community, they are kind of close, because they have this I think it is like in politics, they have this they feel they are hated by everyone. and they end up feeling defensive and superior, and that don't help other people to appreciate their work more, and so everything becomes more difficult. But in theoretically, I think that evolutionary psychology is a beautiful candidate to be a meta theory. Even more that the classical methodological problems, for instance, with massive modularity, are now over. I think we more or less, but I don't think, and most of evolutionary psychologists that I know, they don't have this strict view of massive modularity. Maybe Tubin and Cosme this, but for instance, Marco De Giudice, who I know very well, he always talks about psychological mechanisms. He never used the word models. And but I do think that some insights from the modularity hypothesis must be kept in order to be specific, because a mechanism has to be specific, to some degree automatic, to some degree independent, and it has to be a neural circuitry. Otherwise, I don't know what we are talking about. Of course, the problems lies in, to a certain degree, this is the problem, but to a certain degree, of course. And I don't see how someone can believe in a purely domain general mind, which is a very, very difficult instance to be
right. So, but let me then ask you about another specific kind of approach within psychology. I mean, I'm not sure how you look at it in terms of how it relates to evolutionary psychology, and more specifically evolutionary psychology from Santa Barbara. But what about what people call cultural evolutionary theory, or a cultural evolutionary approach? I mean, is it more prominent in the literature than, let's say, standard evolutionary psychology, or not?
Not at all. So starting from my study, I also, in order to control for the overlapping between EP and SSM, I also investigated the papers which have at least one of the set of keywords and at least one of the set of keywords of the other approach. At least one of the keywords of the EP, at least one of the and at least one of the keywords of SSM. This way, you can track the so-called culturally evolutionary laden contributions. And what we found is that in mainstream psychology, they are fluctuating, almost negligibly around 0%, sometimes 0.03%. But don't be too fast in interpreting this, because we have to remember that, especially in the last years, so the mean of over all the period I investigated, the mean of papers published per year is 100,000. Last years we have 150,000 papers per year on average. So still, when you're talking less than the 1%, you're talking on about 500, 600 papers per year. That means 1 or 2 papers published per day, which isn't that, negligible at all. But if you compare it to the overall amount of the SSM or the EP, this is negligible. Of course, there is this new research program. The problem is that, as we said before, so, for instance, one of the most prominent cultural evolutional research program is, sprouted out of the dual inerrancy theory by Richardson and Boyd.
Yeah.
And we have names like McRath, Enric, and this kind of people there. And and I think their background is mainly, they are biologists, anthropologists, or economists. Very few psychologists there. And they study a broad array of different things, applying these methods from evolutionary biology to cultural traits, the so-called cultural traits. That is socially learned behaviors, tradition of socially learned behaviors. That is, culture is defined by them as a tradition of socially learned behaviors, and cultural traits are this kind of quantifiable traits. But the main problem, and it is very trendy and is very interesting research program. The main problem is that they study anthropological issues, sociological issue, like they are they are more coarse, they are not that fine-grained at the psychological level. They study how is how many economic classes are tied to a specific kind of religion, or how is it the network of collaboration. But from a sociological point of level, they don't get to the individual level of motivation, and ultimately what can help people like me, a clinical psychologist, in my therapy room, because they are studying very broad traditional anthropological issues. And also this is informed, and some scholars at the intersection between these two research programs, by a new approach also in biology, evolutionary biology, that is called the extended evolutionary synthesis, or EVO-DEVO, and some very important people like Marcus Feldman, who initiated actually the dual inerrancy theory in the 70s with Luigi Cavalli-Sforza. They are still alive and kicking and doing their research on extended evolutionary synthesis with Massimo Pigliucci, these kind of guys. And but that kind of research, doing mostly by biologists, by background, is focused on biological stuff, like insects, like ants, like butterflies, and coral reef, that kind of things, which is very interesting from the theoretical point of view. But again, it can say something speculatively about the human mind. I don't know, the famous Baldwin effect, which is
Yes.
called after a psychology, after all, Baldwin. But it is very difficult to see how these predictions by in the time we are speaking are somehow useful for the human behavior. And on the other hand, evolutionary psychology do some study on, or say they are sensitive to cultural differences, but they are not actually. They are not. I don't think they are. And so I think this cultural evolutionary research program may be interesting in anthropology or sociology or even in biology, but so far not in psychology. It is not, mature enough to say something in regards to how we behave at the more fine-grained level. And I think that this is tied to a bigger problem that is, the meaning problem that we spoke about before. I don't know if you want to get it into now or do another question.
Yeah, we can get into it, but let me just say that I agree with you when it comes to where would you put cultural evolutionary theory, and you mentioned anthropology, biology, but not psychology, and I actually agree with that. I mean, when I think about cultural evolutionary theorists, I almost always think of them as being anthropologists.
Yeah.
So.
Or biologists, or biologists who are trained also in anthropology, like for instance Russell Gray, and who is a biologist by background, and then he dedicated himself to anthropology. Yes.
Okay, but then tell us about, because before we started recording, at a certain point you mentioned one issue that you see both. I think that's both within evolutionary psychology, standard evolutionary psychology, and cultural evolutionary theory. That is, you said, I think that they do not address issues regarding meaning, right?
Yeah. I think
Okay,
this is
so explain that then.
Yeah. So in social psychology, in the cultural studies, maybe not in social psychology, but in cultural studies, if you go to a traditional cultural anthropology and ask them what culture is, they will be likely to answer culture is a webs of significance, which is a very famous definition by Clifford Geertz, who is a very famous anthropologist in the classical cultural anthropological tradition.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if you go to the cultural evolutionists who are anthropologists or biologists, they are likely to answer that culture is a tradition of socially learned behaviors, and you can study them behavior also in animals. And so they are very, very incompatible in different definitions, and they are an example on how the natural science and the social science are still divided. And the big divide is on the concept of meaning, and the concept of meaning is tied to the concept of sense making. And sense making is the perhaps uniquely human, as far as we know, capacity to account for reasons in life, and to find all big ideologies and religions, I think they are tied ultimately to answer questions about life, almost trivially.
Right.
I don't think they are like the memetics posits, just pieces of information that want to replicate themselves. I think that Christianity, for instance, is way more complicated than that. It's like it gives a purpose in life to people. I don't think that purpose is something illusionary or non-existent. I do think it is very important. I don't know, there is this beautiful example a friend of mine, Gregor Rix, does, that it is very difficult to explain, for instance, I don't know if you are familiar with the picture of the Vietnamese monk who willingly set himself to fire in order to protest to the government.
Yes. Yes.
And it is very difficult to understand this kind of behavior without taking meaning into account,
Yeah.
And it's very difficult, because probably the guy really believed his gesture was symbolic and necessary, and there was a reason he was pursuing, a name he was pursuing. And also we were talking before about the practice of Japanese people of removing their shoes before getting into the house. And you could speculate a lot about the reasons of this behavior. You could call memetics into question. You could speculate, an advantage to the inclusive fitness. But I think that the easiest thing to do is to tie this behavior to the broader problem in Japanese culture of the division of public and private self. And so you are entering a private space, and you must leave you must be respectful to that, And a lot of different behaviors could be easily explained through this interpretation, which is more qualitative, which is more culturally, more akin to the cultural studies. But nevertheless, it is very compelling. And I think it is also, as a clinical psychologist, it is very compelling when people are facing the absence of meaning in their life. And if you take meaning out of the equation, as everyone is doing right now in the cultural, at least as I know, it is very difficult. Of course, they are aware of the problem, because I do remember the only source in which I found, a small piece of discussion about it is a volume edited, published at the end of the 90s, 1997, by Peter Weingart, who is a German sociologist, and invited a lot of important people, also from evolutionary psychology. I think Cosmides and Tubi were there 1 year in Zurich at this interdisciplinary center to try to help the natural and the social science get along with each other. And he mentioned the meaning problem. So that that there is no theory of the emergence of meaning. And I think the big problem here is that there is a missing point in between our evolutionary history and the emergence somehow, I do think, with the advent of language, of our capacity to account for meaning, which was, I think, a major transition that spurred a lot of religions, mythologies, and things that we are as humans are deeply affected by.
And actually, earlier you mentioned the extended evolutionary synthesis, and I've already talked about this on the show with even some of the most prominent names like Massimo Pigliucci and David Sloan Wilson. And one of the things that they mentioned and other people as well, that could be included within the extended evolutionary synthesis is symbolism. Right.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So symbolism would probably account for what you're saying there, or what you're talking about there. And within anthropology, if we're talking about the study of humans, it would probably fall under semiotics, right?
Yeah. So there is also the line of research called biosemiotics. I don't know a lot about it, but yes. But I don't know how the EES scholar want to address this issue. Maybe you can talk more about it later, because I don't know anything specific. But I do think that one of the most fascinating thing is that we miss an evolutionary link between the emergence of language and the emergence of meaning. And I do have some speculative hypothesis, because there is this friend of mine, Greg Rix, who has this justification hypothesis, which is he thinks that some times ago, about 100,000 years ago, probably our language reached a tipping point in which we transitioned from simple words to do sentences, complex sentences.
Yeah.
And he posits that this kind of, of course it is a speculation, but he thinks that this moment could have been the starting point of mythologies and religions and our capacity of being person other than primates. And it's very fascinating. But what I added to this, justification hypothesis is that I do think that this was probably linked to the emergence of causal clauses. So of why, because, adverbs, which are pervasive when we talk about something, even in the scientific scenario. Causal reasoning is an endemic in explaining why. And as Perber and Mercier said in their book, it is very difficult to distinguish in between retrospective and prospective reasons. So it seems that our brain works as every time we want to account for a reason, we are somehow trying to convince someone, and yes, and so these the dynamics in between convincing others and trying to find a reason why things are the way are. I think it is a fascinating way of study, even though it is a very speculative. I don't know from the operational point of view how to do that, but it is. I think this is the missing link. Yes.
So you think then that even cultural evolutionary theory does not account for things related to meaning and sense making? Is that it?
I don't think so. I never read anything, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is my ignorance. I don't know. I would be very glad to know if you or someone who is watching the show has a different expertise on this, because really. But as far as I know, no. The meaning is, for instance, is very important in clinical psychology. A lot of constructivist theories has been built around the concept of meaning. A lot of clinical works is informed by meaning. For instance, I don't know if you ever read the book by Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who has been in
Man's Search for Meaning.
Maybe, I don't know. I don't know the title.
Viktor Frankl, I think that's the title of the book, Man's Search for Meaning.
You see, that kind of thing. When you experience such troubling and distressing events, such as being in a concentration camp, still the main thing you try to do later on is to explain it. And maybe there is an illusion. Maybe this is our brain just being broken, or maybe there is something bigger out of it. I don't know.
I mean, I don't know what you think about this, but I have this idea that most of what happens in psychotherapy is people, psychotherapists trying to help their patients integrate whatever bad happens in their lives, whatever bad happens in their lives into a personal narrative. And when people are able to integrate that into a personal narrative, then they make sense of it. And that's when they are able to, I don't know, move on with their lives and be more positive, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that I don't think that, finding, reason just cognitively and from a cold perspective can help you. Most of the times that cannot help you, but definitely I think that when you are able to integrate and process all the information in appropriate way, your narrative becomes more
cohesive, perhaps.
Cohesive and coherent. Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you about another thing, because this is also something that you studied. When it comes to evolutionary psychology specifically, what are the main topics of study there? Because because one of the things, interestingly, that I read and heard from people who are not fans of evolutionary psychology but come from other domains, other areas, like, for example, human behavioral ecology or cultural evolutionary theories, that they say that evolutionary psychologists are too focused, too obsessed with topics like mating, for example. So is that true or not?
Yeah, so I did these studies, computational linguistic studies, thanks to a topic modeling approach, or with a thing called latent Dirichlet allocation. And I analyzed if I remember correctly, about 300 or 400 abstracts. The study has still to be published. I just have had a presentation to a conference. But what I found out analyzing the abstracts of ethology and sociobiology, and then evolution and human behavior, so the flagship journal in evolutionary psychology.
Yeah.
By the way, it is also a journal very in which many behavioral ecologists, human behavioral ecologists publish. So there is not that dividing line. But nevertheless, and also just an outside, the other link I found in between the human behavioral ecology, the cultural evolutionary program, and the Santa Barbara EP is that Richardson was the chair of the Evolution and Human Behavior Society, which is the Santa Barbara thing. So this is somehow sometimes they communicate, likely. Getting back to the topics, so thanks to some index, like I found that that are called coherence and stability. I found that the optimal number of topic was 13, and the topic there is mating there, of course.
Mating and sex differences are
definitely
that many people tend to associate with evolutionary psychology.
Definitely yes, but let me take the graph so I can tell you more specifically what I'm talking about. So at the so we have 13 topics first of all, and then I can remember it without looking at it. So there are 13 topics, and I can list them to you. There are vocal communication, kinship and group living, parental investment, male attractiveness, cultural and cross-cultural studies, female mating, life history theory, social learning, disgust system, cooperation, perception, and the kin detection module in the same analysis. Sex difference and mating. Okay. Of course, what I want to stress about this labeling is that topic modeling is kind to factor analysis. So you have, after you decided on the optimal number of topics, you have a list of the most probable words in that topic. And so by looking at the first 10 or 20, you can have an idea on what this topic is about. But of course, it is not something purely objective. This is important to tell you. And so these are the 13 topics. And what I found, I also did a network analysis. So I plotted them graphically, and I saw that of course, mating is super important. But the most central node in a network is life history theory.
Life history theory.
Yeah, and so I think this is I would say this is the most important topic in evolutionary psychology so far. And for instance, some traditional topic like parental investment are colder, so they are decreasing in their prominence in the abstract, so the evolution and human behavior, and previously on ethology and sociobiology. On the other hand, we have this centrality of life history theory. So I would say that it is not at all about mating, but surely traditionally all the most of the evidence on evolutionary psychology is exclusively on mating. David Bass is dedicating himself a lifetime to mating. David Smith, also, and so mating is super important. but I would say that like the contemporary evolutionary psychology is focusing more on life history theory.
Right. Which is interesting because life history theory is something that at least I myself, I've already done more than 1,000 interviews, but I would I would tend to associate it more with the biologists and the behavioral ecologists. So
Yeah, definitely yes. But the cool thing with life history theory is that they have all these nice models, mathematical models. It is highly formal as a theory, and there is also the theory by Marco De Giudice about evolutionary psychology is all centered about life history theory, and I think it is very. This is another thing that clinicians would benefit a lot from evolutionary, like the fact that the condition in which you are raised, the environmental variables, so the harshness and the unpredictability of your environment, really set your biological parameters to a certain functioning, and so you are more prone to go to the fast end of the continuum or to the slow end of the continuum, and that is fascinating because if you have this traditional approach of everything that happens in your first years of life bad is going to ruin you exclusively. On the other hand, if you in a sort of humanistic psychology way see also the good part of the other side of the coin, the good part, you can see that many fascinating adaptations are arising from harsh and unpredictable environment. For instance, all the adaptation in the creative schizotypic spectrum, and also some adaptation in the narcissistic spectrum. Of course, not the not the most disturbing ones, but you see again we are kind of mixing the moral level with the descriptive level, because if you see like most of the top-notch people, successful people even in academia, surely have some dark triad traits. Surely they have, and there have been studies about it. And so of course you can see it morally and that is bad, but you can see it descriptively and that is true, and there are two different things.
right. So let me just ask you, because I was reading here from your paper that you say, as you said there, the two most prevalent specific topics are mating general and life history theory. But then you also mentioned that the two hottest topics are cooperation and male attractiveness, and the two coldest topics are mating general and parental investment theory. So explain that. What?
Yeah, so I have the topic right here. So yes, so speaking of mating, I think that is and it is the first in the cold list. So it is the topic that has decreased with fitting regression line like more sharply. Okay. And so, because mating was very important for David Bass and his collaborators to lay down the very foundation of evolutionary psychology, but I think that I don't know if everything that could have been written on mating has been written, but most of it. So it is like less fascinating for people. And speaking of the cold topics, the other cold topics are parental investment and the same thing, which is mating and parental investment are kind of intertwined, because Trivers' theory about parental investment informed David Bass on mating. And speaking of the hot topic, so I would say that speaking of the first one, which is cooperation, I would say that this is the reason, this is informed by the cultural evolutionary program, because cooperation is traditionally studied, through game theory, for instance. And so highly mathematical model, more prone to a kind of anthropological lens. Because cooperation has been studied traditionally by anthropologists rather than psychologists, and I think this reflects what we were talking about before. So the fact that cultural evolution is a super trendy research program, and so you see it also in evolution and human behavior. Yeah.
Mhm.
And speaking of on the other hot topics, also so we like if we go on the ranking, we have cooperation, and then we have male attractiveness, which is the second,
Right.
which nevertheless tied to mating. I don't know if I have something to say about it. And then we have cultural and cross-cultural, which is again tied to the cultural evolution research program, I would say.
Yeah.
And then we have the disgust system, which is very interesting because the disgust system in the network analysis, it isn't so a network analysis for those who doesn't know it is basically a way to see partial correlations. So uniquely the correlation between variables controlling for the correlation with the other variables. So these
Okay.
x and y, the magnitude of this relationship is controlled by the other, potentially confounding variables like z in between them. And so you can see how things are related to each other. And the disgust system is far away from the rest of the graph. And the interesting thing is that it is like attachment, a motivational system, but it has been studied very specifically from the immunological perspective, and so it is very not tied to the other rest of the evolutionary reasoning. But it is a kind of I've been to a conference, and there were a lot of contribution about disgust, so the tendency to avoid potential pathogens in the environment. And then we have vocal communication, which is the fifth. But I don't know if I have something to say about vocal communication. I think vocal communication is it has been considered as a separate topic because of the technicalities of the LDA approach, and but it could be easily I think merged on one end to mating, because are studying study the tone of males, how it is perceived as attractive or not attractive by women. Or I think the other way it could be studied is maybe in status competition. But yes, I think this is what this topic is about.
So just before we wrap up our conversation, let me ask you a broad question. So when it comes to evolutionary psychology possibly being a scientific revolution, you said no. But then, I mean, how do you look at perhaps the future of psychology, taking into account all of the issues that we pointed to there, including the fact that the several different subdisciplines tend to be insular and there's not many cross-fertilization, there's not lots of cross-fertilization across the different psychological subdisciplines. So how do you look at it? Do you think that there's any chance of, in the somewhat near future, having something that could become or that could turn psychology into a paradigmatic discipline?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Luckily, I wish I was more hopeful and optimistic, but I'm not. I'm not. If I have to be honest, I see that I don't know in the years to come, but as for now, I see this is a malady and a problem. The prominence of the standard social science model approach is getting bigger and bigger, and it's getting ideological, and this is scary for me. This is scary for me because I have many emails, asking for editors and collaborators in leading journals in the field, and I perceive them a kind of racist because they just want, people marginalized or by I do call it BICOP communities, and I don't like this kind of trend which is endemic in the US academia. So speaking of the brief or medium term, I see this is a problem. I don't know if this is the main problem of psychology, but this is one problem. I see that it's getting more and more ideological, and I think this is a huge problem. As an aside, another big problem is tied to another bigger problem, not tied exclusively to psychology, but is that of hyperproductivity. And I think that most of scientific, so for instance, in the study I've done on PsycInfo, we found that each days on PsycInfo, so the medium, on average, each day in scientific psychology, if you call scientific psychology each paper indexed in PsycInfo, we have 437.5 papers published. That means approximately one paper every 3 minutes.
Okay. That's a bit ridiculous.
That's totally ridiculous. You think, of course, as science grows, you cannot be you can be specialized in your own niche. Of course, you can. There is no Leonardo da Vinci anymore in our society, and that's okay. But this kind of hyperproductivity, which is not an exclusive of psychology, is endemic in medicine, biology, engineering, and whatever. It's pushing the scientific standards down. And I see also in my personal academic life, and I think I'm about to finish my PhD, and then I think I will have some time away from academia. Maybe in the future I will be back at it, but for now I have to spend some time away. I see that scientific transparency and quality are super rare, and most of the time is like who who you are submitting your paper with, and so that is another, and most of the, and I'm not afraid to say it, most of the professors, even full professor I know, they are not good scientists. Most of them. Like I can count on my hand, the good scientists I know. Like at least not speaking of pure intellectual ability, which is one thing and is surely important, but about ethical transparency and the willingness of doing a research just to do the research, just to answer the fucking question, And I think that's kind of disturbing. And so this is one other bigger problem, not tied to psychology, which is also kind of, people do not have time to read papers. People, and most importantly, people do not have time to think. And they think that, theoretical question, because one of the problems of evolutionary psychology is that it's heavy theoretically laden. And I love it for that, because it has a lot of theory behind it. And it is very rare in psychology. If you go to social psychology, it's all, structural equation models, factor loadings. Now we have a theory. this kind of attitude, And on the other end, the thing I love of evolutionary psychology, and they spend time in thinking, okay, what is the most reasonable theory to endorse, to have a decent theory of the human mind? We have this proposal. Maybe we are wrong in some regards, but we have this proposal. And I think this is still the most solid and robust proposal, because it ties psychology to biology, which is a necessity, in my opinion. And still, a lot of people do not have the time to think, or do not have interest in theoretical issues, and so they are, this super empiricism, which is a catastrophe in psychology. And so this is the third reason. So first reason, we have the SSM, the ideology. Then we have hyperproductivity. Then we have the unwillingness of scholars to think and to read. And so I don't see it as possible for evolutionary psychology or other theories to become paradigms. I see the possibility, to be honest, of the SSM as for now, the standard social model. On the other hand, it seems that it is right now the closest thing to a paradigm in psychology that I ever seen in my life, because people are scared of being against it. And so, they don't want to do anything against it. And I don't know, maybe this is not going to last, hopefully, but actually this is quite endemic among people. For instance, a lot of people in neuroscience are more than happy to join SSM instances. So people, biology-oriented people.
Yeah.
And so yes, I'm not that hopeful for the future. And I don't know if we will. Maybe the only thing we will be ever able is that when we'll have that knowledge of genetics that will help us, in tracing, the power of genetics in determining our dispositions. That could be one thing. But you see, this is very problematic relationship with ethics and with the temptation to conflate is versus ought, and the human hold to human, as Nietzsche used to say, tendency of not being transparent and honest in life. And yeah, as for now, I'm not optimistic.
Well, it is
I don't
what
know,
it is.
you? What do you think?
I mean, I'm also not very optimistic, particularly even more so because of the lack of cross-fertilization and the fact that people do not have enough time to familiarize themselves with other specialized areas. So yeah, it's very complicated. I don't blame anyone. I don't blame people in general, because it's also very hard to have enough time to do that. So and
Yeah.
perhaps just having more time to think would be good, because if you go back and look into the biographies of some of the greatest geniuses in history, they all had tons of time to think. So right.
I think it took Darwin something like 20 or 30 years to write The Origin of Species, which
Yeah.
is unthinkable in these times. Unthinkable.
No.
Unthinkable. You do not even have 20 days. So it's kind of you don't have that time to think. And yes, I think this is the major problem. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Okay, so good question. So you can contact me in my email. I can, which is I don't know if you can
Link, put it on the description. Yeah,
on
yeah, I can
description,
do that.
my personal email. Then I'm building my personal site, which will be online, I think, in 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know when will this be released, but I have a personal site. I have also an Instagram account, which is more like in Italian. So because I kind of do I love to do kind of popular science video to to communicate science. I also have a TikTok account, but it's in Italian, so I don't know if the people of watching this video are interested in it. But I can share with you all the details, and you can find them in the description. And if you have some questions, please do not hesitate in contacting me in my personal email, for sure. Yes.
Great. So, look, I really loved this conversation.
Me
I
too.
was very much looking forward to it, and I think it was very productive and informative. So, thank you so much for doing
Thank
this.
you. Thank you too. See you guys.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters. Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.